there is this tendency that I've noticed in which it comes across as if people are deliberately misrepresenting you. And so this is, my question to you is, when you see yourself being misrepresented or when you see other people being misrepresented, do you think that this is largely, and I know it's case by case basis, it's different for many people, but do you see a general trend of some people seeming to misrepresent you for strategic purposes because they'll know that their audience doesn't, they're probably not going to look into you, right? Most people, let's say on the left, don't really know what Ben Shapiro believes. They know what their favorite commentator says Ben Shapiro believes, and vice versa. Do you think it's a combination of that? Do you think it's a combination of people sort of being very tribal and complacent and they'll sort of just go with the flow? Or do you think people just simply kind of already have expected opinions on you, right? They'll hear your opinion on this and they'll say, oh, she's an evil person, so therefore she's wrong and everything. Do you have a general idea of what seems to be going on here?
I think it's both. And there are clear, social media obviously exacerbates this problem, and there are clear incentives to misread people. If you can quote tweet Ben Shapiro, misinterpret what he's saying, and your audience loves it, then it doesn't really matter what the truth is to you. And there are people who have made that sort of their beat. There's Aaron Rupar, who formerly of Vox News, the guy who tweets, 15-second video clips and out of context or like totally misrepresents what happens on such a regular basis. And it's been really successful for somebody like him. So yeah, I think it's probably both. And I try to assume good faith among critics. I think that all of us are so tribalized right now and so convinced that, or not all of us, but most of us are so tribalized right now and so convinced that the other side, as though there are two sides in American politics. It's such a simplification that my side is right and your side is wrong. And that's what it comes down to. And I think it's become increasingly difficult to see people as just fellow human beings who honestly believe what they say. And we can see that just in terms of rates of, marriage across party lines and things like that are declining. A lot of people in the sort of like blue bubble areas where I live don't know a single conservative or don't have a single conservative friend. And when you don't know people who think differently than you, it becomes really easy to demonize them and assume things about them that aren't necessarily true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really strips away the humanity from a lot of people. I always say, like, there are so many people out there that believe genuinely horrific things or things that I perceive to be horrific, but most people believe, right? So I guess in the spirit of Atheists for Liberty, of the term atheist in there, I think, one of the most horrifying beliefs that I can think of is just the idea of hell, the concept of hell in general, that anyone who isn't a part of your tribe, whether that means by virtue of you just having a different opinion or by just the sheer unluckiness of being born in a different geographic region, you're going to suffer eternal punishment for all of eternity, the worst imaginable pain. I think that's one of the worst things anyone could possibly think. But I recognize, I recognize that, look, so many people believe this, and a lot of people, just don't think too deeply about it, or they grew up with it, right? And they focus on the good things that come from religion. But you can't, if you just let that be the entire identity of someone and it clouds your judgment of everything else that they believe, it really strips away the humanity of that person, of that individual, and it stops conversation. And for as annoying as Neil deGrasse Tyson can be sometimes, one of the great things that I really love that he said was that without conversation there is no civilization, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. So it's horrible to see the direction that conversation has taken Twitter. It's Twitter, even if we really even want to point to Twitter as emblematic of how conversations go about.
Right.
But yeah, and so another thing that I've noticed, and that this is going to start leading into the conversation of culture versus policy, is a lot of people also seem to just downplay the issues on their side because they're focusing on the grander issues. So, so for instance, someone like David Pakman, who's on the progressive left, he'll have Douglas Murray on, and he'll agree with most of what Douglas Murray says in terms of identifying issues on the woke left. David Pakman will say, look, I completely agree with you. I just don't think it's that big of a deal. When you have someone like Donald Trump, who said he's going to run for president again, and he's inviting these very nefarious characters like Yi and Nick Fuentes and Milo Yiannopoulos. Are we seriously going to be concerned right now with people who have pronouns in their bio?
Right.
And so, and it's really hard to have a convincing argument against that. But because Block and Report focuses a lot on cultural issues, and you guys focus a lot on the excesses of the left, as well as going against people on the right. What would be your response to someone who says that we really shouldn't talk that much about what's going on in the woke left? Because, I mean, comparatively speaking, and not just the United States, look at what's going on in Western Europe with the rise of right-wing populism. It's not that big of a deal. How would you respond to someone like that?
Right. This is something I've given a lot of thought to, and I think there's some validity to the argument. Of course, there's always going to be something worse somewhere in the world. Like, why haven't we all stopped reporting on why are there sports reporters when there's, a famine in Yemen? That's always going to exist. It is always worse somewhere else. Part of the reason I think this is important is because culture does have a huge impact on politics. And we can see this in a lot of the legislation that has been proposed by both the right and the left in the last couple of years. So it's not like these things just exist in a vacuum. It's not as though pronouns in bio doesn't translate to institutions being captured. I wrote a piece for Barry Weiss's Substack earlier this year, maybe last year, about medical schools ceasing to teach sex instead of gender because of complaints from their students when they would use terms like male and female. That's important, and I think that it's the obligation of journalists to cover things that are actually happening. That said, I don't think that we should solely or even partially vote based on cultural issues. And I have a number of listeners, and I know a number of people, including some friends, who see what's happening on the woke left, for lack of a better term, and they've decided that in response to that, they're going to become Trump supporters. And I think that's a flawed idea for a couple of reasons. For one, I think a large part of the woke left is a direct reaction to Donald Trump, and it's not as though wokeness disappeared when Biden got into office, but I do think things would be worse if he weren't, both culturally and politically. And I also just think there are bigger issues. If you're somebody who there are reasons to vote, valid reasons to vote Republican. If you want low taxes, if you want little regulation, if you don't care about things like the EPA, then sure, vote for Republicans. But if you do care about those things and things like abortion, then I don't think voting against Democrats is in your best interest. And so to me, I do vote according to bigger policy proposals, because I think a lot of these things also aren't ultimately going to resolve themselves in the halls of Congress. They need to resolve themselves on a cultural level. And I also there's this tendency, and I think it's a small one, thankfully, but among some people, there's a tendency to vote according to who annoys them most on Twitter. And I just don't think that's a good way to do politics. It's not how I do politics, at least.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's amazing. It seems like such a simple thing to say, but really, you can do two things at once. You can criticize two different groups of people at once. I think the biggest concerns that I personally have when it comes to thinking about society, when it comes to thinking about civilization, I'm thinking of things like climate change. I'm thinking of things like the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I'm thinking about artificial intelligence and how it's going to become weaponized. But the solution to having to focusing on that more isn't to talk about social, like woke social issues less. It's just to talk about it more. Right. And you can do both of these things at once. And it is important, as you said. I mean, when you have the Smithsonian publishing that, punctuality is a virtue of whiteness, that's not something small. That's a big deal. When you have entire universities just, basically, I think FIRE came out with a report that said that over 50% of students think that that students should be free from offensive language. I mean, that's not a small thing. That's a pretty big thing, and we're talking about the academy. We're talking about the future of our civilization, basically. We
Right.
should be worried about that, and focusing on that and being concerned about that does not entail ignoring other issues that are more important. You can do both things at once. I completely agree with you. And yeah, also don't vote based on who annoys you the most on Twitter. That's a horrible policy.
Right.
That's not
If we're following, if that's the rule, then nobody should vote at all because everybody's annoying on Twitter.